Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat from mxdwn.com. That's Mixdown. Thanks for joining us again. We got a ton of stuff to discuss and not a lot of time to get into it, so let's just dive right in. First and foremost, James Gunn, who previously has been known as the writer-director of the very successful Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 and 2 movies for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, has now, of course, we've reported on this a few times before in the past for you, paired with Peter Safran to become the new head of DC Studios as far as their superhero comic book movie subject matter. We've got all kinds of twists and turns in that, including things that were expected, like Henry Cavill returning to the role of Superman, or a Wonder Woman 3, helmed by Patty Jenkins, all basically being declared no. Effectively, James Gunn indicated that wouldn't be happening and that he had a different plan. Well, now James Gunn has come out with the elaborate series of things they do have planned. And it's super, super intricate, and, DC fans are probably going to be very, very excited for what's bound to come. It looks like, at least on paper, that James Gunn and Peter Safran have basically decided to try to emulate something of the approach of what Marvel did as they were starting to pick up steam as their own studio. Now, when you go back to that early phase of superhero movies, you had Spider-Man, you had X-Men, you had some crappy Fantastic Four movies, and then ultimately Marvel kind of took a best of the rest approach and took Iron Man and Thor and the Hulk and basically everyone else and paired them up and started doing individual movies, and then ultimately, of course, the Avengers, which was such a massive hit. Really is getting going, the whole ball rolling that we now kind of could refer to as the juggernaut of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So James Gunn's plan here is to take a lot of the legacy characters that may or may not be quite as famous, but at least beloved within DC's stable of comic book characters, and then to effectively use the diamond characters, as he put it, the very famous ones, your Wonder Womans, your Supermans, your Batmans, to help prop up these new characters. So what you have is the feeling of kind of a second tier of characters that, have always been a thing in terms of the universe of the DC Comics stable of characters, but then now are going to start to be surfaced as if they're A-tier kind of stories and characters, hopefully to build up a whole new franchise. James Gunn has basically indicated that this is going to be a shared universe, that effectively all of the different properties, both in movies and in TV, are going to be a part of the same different ecosystem, just like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and even a little better than, say, the first phase of Marvel Cinematic Universes, TV shows, which were only loosely connected to the movies. And there's a few different things that have already been in the rolling, and effectively there's the Flash movie coming up. That's basically done, so there's nothing to be changed about that. There's Shazam, Fury of the Gods, the sequel to Shazam, that's already done. But then the other pieces of stuff that are out there in the world, which specifically refer to Todd Phillips' series of award-winning Joker movies starring Joaquin Phoenix, and then Matt Reeves' new kind of take, very, very, very dark and violent take on the Batman, also are going to continue to exist separately, kind of like a parallel universe. And anything that isn't this new DC Studios universe, they're going to be referring to as Elseworlds. And in the midst of this announcement, all kinds of other things that people have liked on some level of DC comic book fare, mainly in TV shows, have also hit the chopping block, not the least of which to include Pennyworth, the Doom Patrol, and Titans on HBO Max, which are either going to finish their series that's coming up, the next season that's about to hit, or they've just had the plug pulled completely. So in the midst of this announcement, James Gunn basically indicated a slew of things that are going to happen over just the next few years. And basically, they span the gamut of all kinds of stuff that's going on. In the world of TV, there's going to be a show called Lanterns, featuring two of the Green Lanterns, not to get too far in the weeds for you non-comic book people, but there's basically a whole continuity of Green Lanterns. There's not just one Green Lantern. So it's going to be Jon Stewart and Hal Jordan, not the actor, but the character. And then effectively, it's going to be, according to James Gunn, like a True Detective style approach to Green Lantern. It's like they're space cops protecting Earth. There's also going to be a spin-off show coming from the Suicide Squad movies called Waller, featuring the character Amanda Waller that Viola Davis played, and of course Viola Davis will be reprising her role. Interesting to note that that's one of the few pieces of serious casting news to come up out of all the announcements I'm about to list out for you here. There's going to be another show called Paradise Lost. It's going to be focusing on Themyscira, which is of course where Wonder Woman hails from and is famously like the origin of Wonder Woman. There's going to be a whole show based on Booster Gold, and that's a fun rabbit hole to go down if you're not familiar with Booster Gold and what that character is and what that means. And then there's also going to be a cartoon called Creature Commandos. James Gunn did indicate that even the cartoon fare that is a part of this universe will still be a part of the shared universe of the DC Studios, DC film universe. Now, on the movie side, There's a whole bunch of movies that's been announced too, and once again, without almost anything in terms of casting information or directors or writers attached. Some James Gunn has indicated he's working on personally, but we don't have any final reporting on any of the real personnel behind these particular pictures and the cast that are going to be in them. So there's going to be, not with Henry Cavill, a new Superman movie called Superman Legacy. There's going to be a new, very darker take on Supergirl based on more modern stories. There's going to be a story called The Brave and the Bold. Now, this is going to be actually a Batman and Robin feature, but effectively it's going to be based on a more modern take on Batman involving one of the Robins called Damian Wayne, which is essentially a form of Bruce Wayne's son. There's going to be a Swamp Thing feature, and then something for people a little bit more in the weeds in terms of different characters in like the Wildstorm universe of DC, which is going to be called The Authority. James Gunn promised in the video that he released, indicating and promoting this news, that storytelling is always king. That's all that matters to us. Now, over in the world purely of television, we've been talking to you a lot the last few weeks about the new show, The Last of Us. Now, The Last of Us was, of course, adapted from the incredibly successful franchise of video games by the same name. They're absolutely genius. If you haven't played them, if you can handle super dark, super violent subject matter, there's nothing I could possibly recommend to you more. And like I promised a couple weeks ago, people are finding that this show is a gigantic hit and is basically becoming more and more and more popular. It's the second biggest ever debut for an HBO show behind House of the Dragon, and then it has now already boasted the biggest growth between episode 1 and episode 2, and then episode 2 and episode 3, percentage-wise. This week's episode doing 6.4 million viewers, which is also, of course, above the 5.7 million viewers that it did last week, and then the 4.5 that it did the first week. So the show is already massively popular, and this third week's episode very much blew up across everything that is the internet in terms of people's attention, because it featured I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but a heartbreaking and heartwarming story featuring Nick Offerman and Murray Bartlett playing the characters Bill and Frank. If you know the game, the story's a little different than what happens in the game story, but it is moving and brilliant and beautiful. It is like very few things that have ever been adapted in the world of games. And Nick Offerman, very famous for a slew of different things, not the least of which being Parks and Recreation. I mean, he's done a lot of amazing stuff in his career. Probably his best performance yet. Must be seen if you haven't seen it. And once again, of course, if you can tolerate super violent subject matter, if you can tolerate super dark subject matter, the show is amazing. Elsewhere in the world of music, Ozzy Osbourne has officially canceled his many times delayed, long promised UK tour featuring Judas Priest. Now, this is a show that has been basically scheduled and then rescheduled and scheduled and rescheduled. And boy, Ozzy Osbourne, the famed original Black Sabbath singer, has effectively been dealing with a battery of different health problems. And is effectively, this just comes literally on the heels of the last 48 hours, issued a statement. And effectively, his statement was pretty much putting it all on the table that about 4 years ago, he suffered a spine injury. And then he has been trying everything in his power to try to recover from that spine injury in the years since, and especially lately. And apparently, it's just not getting good enough, fast enough. Apparently, he can sing as well as he could ever hope to, and his voice is held up very well. But as he put it, his body is still physically weak. Apparently, they've been trying everything from physical therapy to the stem cell treatment. He's had 3 different operations, and then apparently even a groundbreaking cybernetics HAL treatment. And the thing that most people are focusing on right now, which is going to be the point of a lot of debate, I think, in the weeks to come, because, in the world of hard rock and heavy metal, they basically don't get much more famous than Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne is kind of a legend for a reason. I mean, his, work with both his solo stuff with Randy Rhoads in the early 80s, and then, of course, most famously Black Sabbath in the 70s, ostensibly formulated a whole branch of music, a gigantic genre featuring hundreds of thousands of bands, all basically mapped back to Black Sabbath, no matter who you debate with when it comes to what are the origins of heavy metal. I mean, there's certainly a lot of debate over where did it really start, but it's really Black Sabbath. It's the template for what heavy metal is mostly thought of nowadays. So the line that people are going to be focusing on, not to digress any further here, is how he literally says, "Never would I have imagined that my touring days would have ended this way. My team is currently coming up with ideas to where I will be able to perform without having to travel from city to city and country to country." Now, a lot of outlets and a lot of people out there have already come to the conclusion that they understand what that means. And a lot of people are saying, that's it. Ozzy's done. That's the end of touring for Ozzy Osbourne. He won't be playing any more shows. I'm old enough to remember, not to date myself too badly, that in the wake of the time after his incredible early 90s record with Zakk Wylde on guitar, No More Tears, that there was a whole series of tours that Ozzy Osbourne, basically scheduled and stacked up in the 90s that were literally called No More Tours. No more tours for Ozzy. And that was supposed to be the end. That was supposed to be the retirement tour. Ozzy's retired from touring 5 or 6 times that I can remember, and not to mention that Black Sabbath hung it up 5 or 6 times that I can remember, and that time basically since 1991. So, I mean, I wouldn't count Ozzy Osbourne out. It's terrible to hear that his health is suffering the way that it is. It's terrible to hear that he's not feeling well, that he doesn't feel up to it, that they're trying this hard, and I'm probably spending a fortune trying to get him the therapy and the medical help that he needs to try to recover from this. But just knowing Ozzy, if there's any way to, it's probably still going to happen as long as he's here, as long as he's alive and healthy enough to do it. So I wouldn't count him out yet, but you're going to see a lot of reporting and a lot of talk online that people have come to the conclusion that this is it, that effectively that Ozzy is done and that everything has happened, or other people already saying, oh yeah, he'll be back out, no big deal. So I would wait and see if I were you. And then over and kind of a bizarre story in the world of music, there's an artist that you'll probably be hearing more about soon, Zara Larsson, Swedish pop artist. And effectively, Zara Larsson is a person that has taken advantage of, I guess you could say, a trend that's been popular for the last bunch of years. And, for a lot of people in kind of the mainstream, you're probably going to be completely unaware of this. But certain people in either very hip circles or in like purist heavy metal circles are going to be intimately familiar with this, which is that there has been a stylistic trend of the last few years, kind of a détournement, if you will, of basically very fashionable women wearing t-shirts or clothing of heavy metal bands. And, a lot of this is just the very obvious stuff, the Megadeth logo, the Slayer logo. And I mean, that very kind of metallic and angular kind of stuff. And, for the most part, let's be honest, wearing them ironically, right? Anachronistically, effectively not necessarily being fans of the subject matter, but just making a fashion statement with it and just kind of being like, this is what cool, attractive people wear. Okay, fine. And, it's been its own kind of lightning rod of controversy over the last chunk of time where effectively, there are certain people that don't think the culture of heavy metal should be appropriated into like super glossy, poppy fashion. And then there's other people who are like, who the hell cares? What right do you give to tell anybody what they can and can't wear? Right. And so effectively, it's a pretty simple and silly thing. And that's why you might even have seen there's like a meme that went around the internet, especially on Instagram, of a guy chasing a girl and then basically, freaking out saying, name 3 bands. Basically coming from the joke that people are, approaching women who've worn this kind of stuff, essentially challenging them to actually prove that they're a fan of it. Thus, otherwise, they don't have the right to wear the stuff, which is a pretty ridiculous and stupid thing. But I'm sure that most of those bands don't care that their merch got bought or that someone out there is advertising their logo or their story. But apparently, certain people, from a purity standpoint, take issue with it. Now, what happened here is that Zara Larsson at I will say a little known as far as our world, basically an awards show called P3 Gold, effectively wore kind of a custom dress that featured several different logos of bands in it. And effectively, a couple of the obvious ones were Cannibal Corpse and Behemoth. But one of the things that was in this dress that eagle-eyed people over at several of the major heavy metal magazines noticed was that the lightning rod of controversy, Burzum, was one of the logos that was featured in this dress. Now, Zara Larsson, as she was basically doing this, posted a TikTok dancing around, cavorting, looking sexy, wearing this dress or whatever, or, I'm not characterizing her as sexy. I guess that's what she was trying to do. And then effectively, people figured it out. There's the Burzum logo. Do you even know who Burzum is or what Burzum stands for? Now, this is a bit of a rabbit hole. We're not going to go too far down this on this week's show. But Burzum is a now defunct band from the, as controversial as it gets, heavy metal figure Varg Vikernes. Varg Vikernes has gone by a series of different names over the year. None of those are his actual real name, and effectively was one of the early members of the even more controversial black metal band Mayhem. And, if you start looking up Varg Vikernes and what he's reputed for, there is all kinds of stuff, allegations or temporary imprisonment or long imprisonment, and in terms of allegations of racism or terrorism or burning down churches. And there's some controversy into whether any of those things did happen or didn't happen. And then, of course, there's a litany of apologists for people who are fans of his music. But then on the other hand, there's a lot of super obvious, like terrible, heinous behavior. There's a reason that a lot of people basically look with disdain at Varg Vikernes. And effectively, while Burzum was a thing, a lot of this super hateful and terrible stuff was spouted. So Zara Larsson wore this band's logo on her clothing, not having any idea what Burzum meant, what Burzum has talked about, what the music is, just thought it looked good. And effectively upon being called out about it, and this is of course translated from Swedish, there hasn't been a statement in English yet, said something to the effect of, oopsie, had no idea. Just a word for the wise, if you're going to do something super fashionable in the name of just trying to look edgy or cool, might not be a bad idea if you tried to make sure you understood the stuff that you're wearing, what it stood for. If you're not okay with that, you might not want to represent that so powerfully. And then lastly, just a short note for the world of video games. IGN is reporting, no one else has this yet, and there hasn't been any official statement, so of course, this could very well change, but IGN is reporting that E3 finally returning to an in-person session this year, at the LA Convention Center like it always did before the COVID-19 pandemic. Apparently, the three biggest video game developers and platforms apparently won't be there. Now, of course, this is only reported on by IGN, but it's Nintendo, Sony PlayStation, and Xbox are all saying, at least through sources that IGN has, that they're not going to be there. Now, they haven't officially made statements indicating that, and neither has E3. But obviously, this is kind of a massive problem. For anybody who's keeping scores, paid attention to the world of video games, PlayStation has sat out many of the last E3s, and Xbox has kind of been like slowly dragging themselves out the door and kind of having something kind of outside the convention center. And PlayStation just basically decided years ago, like, we don't need to compete. We're king of the mountain. We don't care if we're there. We don't care if we have to show anything off. We'll show our stuff off whenever we feel like it. And I mean, generally speaking, they haven't had any trouble selling video games. So we'll keep an eye on this. And then basically, to put it simply, for anyone who's a fan of video games, I mean, this is either very good or very bad for E3, which was for a long time the biggest convention of any kind, except for CES, for any kind of thing. And of course, the entire year mile marker of the video game industry, where effectively games would make or break their reputation for the next year. So what we're going to find out is it could be very good for it, meaning that newer developers who have something to prove could find a place and, actually have a pedestal to be on, since they're not going to be competing with those major platforms. Or it could be terrible. It could mean that a lot of people don't go because they're expecting not to see anything that's significant. So that's all our stories for this week as far as news. And I wanted to just give a quick story, a little thing from my past, just as a kind of a fun little thing and a look down memory lane here, just to go a different route than some of the other previous monologues we've had in the show. And I'm going to take you back to a thing that I personally experienced. And this is a long time ago. We're talking now 26 years ago, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, and it goes back to July 13th, 1997. This was one of my earliest concerts that I ever attended. Not the first, because there was a whole bunch before this, but this was also my very first festival, and this was what was, at that time, the last touring incarnation of Lollapalooza. There was one that came some years later and then got, that happened for a little bit, and then they got canceled, and then they tried again, and then ultimately, of course, it settled in Chicago as a major mainstay festival. But this was one of the last successful times that there was a traveling Lollapalooza festival. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar, Lollapalooza came on the scene kind of as a part of Perry Farrell's vision of Jane's Addiction's, at that time, demise. Of course, we've also talked a lot on the show about how Jane's Addiction's back alive and well, and unfortunately, Dave Navarro, having suffered from COVID-19 and ostensibly having apparently very bad long COVID symptoms, has been sitting out the tour dates, and various people have been kind of filling in, and they've been still, playing on, just waiting for Dave Navarro to come back. And Eric Avery, who long was out of Jane's Addiction, is back. But at the time, in the early part of the 90s, Lollapalooza was born kind of as like a farewell for Jane's Addiction, but then became the de facto summer touring experience as far as experiencing alternative music at that time. And a lot of heavyweights became champions behind their role on those shows. If you really want to have your jaw hit the floor, go look at the lineup for Lollapalooza in 1992, where the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Ministry, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Temple of the Dog all played on one bill. how that's even possible is kind of astounding to think that that was a thing. Smashing Pumpkins headlined one year, Beastie Boys played one year, Hole headlined one year. And effectively, the first time that I had a chance to, the first time me and my friends were old enough to have the ability to, was in 1997. Now, a lot had changed by 1997 in terms of what music was and where it was going. That whole grunge alternative thing was kind of starting to fade away, and electronic music was becoming really big. And this is right about the moment that, like, the whole giant, like, British invasion of what we called at the time big beat music was starting to come on the scene. So big beat music was kind of your Chemical Brothers, the Prodigy kind of era of music, Fatboy Slim to some extent. And effectively, at the same time, new metal was starting to formulate right around this moment. And this is where rock and, rap metal were starting to become a more common thing. And so effectively, the lineup of this moment at that particular bill kind of was a reflection of that. And the tour suffered, I think, a little bit because it didn't have a consistent headliner through all the dates. Some of the dates were Devo. Some of the dates were The Prodigy, who obviously became very successful in the couple of years right there at that moment. And then the date that I was fortunate to see was Orbital, who were, if you haven't heard Orbital, were absolutely amazing and just a wonderful, wonderful band. Still around to this day, broke up a few times, the brothers P&B Hartnell, but effectively back together and releasing new music all the time. Anyway, effectively, me and a handful of my friends crammed in a car and then went out there and then found that several other of our friends had all elected to go there. Probably not the least of which the reason because Tool was going to be one of the main stage bands that day. The lineup was pretty ridiculous for that moment. And, probably the least of which was James, who, some people might know for that one-hit wonder single in the early 90s, Laid. But then the rest of the day featured a bevy of really incredible people. Tricky played, Korn played, Snoop Dogg, who at the time was going by Snoop Doggy Dogg, not just Snoop Dogg or Snoop Lion, as he's sometimes referred to, Tool, and then ultimately closing with Orbital. Now, it was hot. This was an insanely hot. If you haven't been in Connecticut in the summer, Connecticut can be brutally humid. Everything is incredibly warm and hot in Connecticut. And ostensibly, it was the kind of thing where you're standing out there in shorts and a short sleeve shirt and you're just drenched in sweat. So the thing that happened there, and I haven't seen this almost ever since, was mist tents was a very big thing. This is just basically a tent where like water was piped through the ceiling and there's just mist kind of constantly going there. So basically wherever me and my friends were, we were just running into mist tents all day, trying to stay cool. And effectively, I'd say like a hodgepodge of attractions. Like your average festival nowadays was immensely better than what we experienced then. I remember there was some kind of a crappy sequencing DJ software that someone showed. The Spawn movie was coming out, so there was a very cool soundtrack to the first Spawn, Todd McFarlane Spawn movie, and there was a bunch of like metal bands paired with electronic people, kind of in line with that whole, the Crow soundtrack, and then effectively, kind of latching onto that moment of the explosion of electronic music as far as the world was concerned. And, not much else. A little bit of some social activist awareness, but mostly it was just the bands. Now, this particular venue was what we call an amphitheater, right? A shed. One of the big buildings where you have a giant sweeping lawn and then, some tiers of seats, effectively. And this was, at the time, the Meadows Music Theater in Connecticut. And the Meadows was, gigantic place when you were 16, 17 years old and a time like that. I mean, the lawn just stretched on forever. And of course, in those days, this is before the fiasco at the Roskilde Festival with Pearl Jam, where people got trampled. People were just jumping seats left and right, trying to get further and trying to get closer. Like people were trying to be on the lawn, but find a way to get to, further, closer up seats. And then, that day you could get away with it. But nowadays, if you go to a venue like that, I mean, it's like military scale lockdown. You're not jumping seats like that anymore. And effectively, we kind of bopped around seeing other friends and other people. It was basically like this particular tour this one year had drew just about every single person that was kind of like vaguely counterculture out to this show. So there was a whole flotilla of us out there to see it. I can't say I remember much about what Tricky's set was like, because Tricky's music is always about the same, but really nice and really soothing and really cool. It's dark, sinister sound. Korn was the height of their skill and their power. If you've never been a fan of that band, that would have been the tour to see them. That was just following their second album, Life is Peachy, after their self-titled album in 1994, before Follow the Leader hit, and they had become basically the biggest mainstream rock band in the world, and they kind of got a little bit more bloated, and that's when their material, in my opinion, started to take a bit of a nosedive from there. But I mean, God, as raw and fierce as anything could possibly be. What was evident, though, as much as Snoop Dogg was an interesting inclusion, and I remember him very specifically smoking a lot of blunts on stage and, asking people to say biatch over and over again, was Tool. Everyone was there to see Tool, which isn't terribly surprising given their reputation and their size and their stature in the modern age. And I mean, the place was filled. I mean, there was not an inch of space in that theater when Tool was playing. And, I remember vividly that, they had some video monitors in adornment, but this was before they became the multimedia spectacle that they're famous for being now. I mean, sometimes you can go see Tool and not really even see the members of the band because of how elaborate their stage setup is or their video projections. Maynard James Keenan, the lead singer, is usually in the back. This particular set, the drummer Danny Carey was in the back and Maynard was in the front and center. And he was kind of divided in half. Like there was a line down the middle of his body, and on the one side it was white and the other side it was blue. And then effectively over on the one side, bassist Justin Chancellor was blue, and on the other side, guitarist Adam Jones was all painted in white. And there was some kind of a duality, kind of thing they had going on. And people were ferociously happy to see them play. This is, of course, after their masterpiece, probably one of the better metal records you're ever going to hear, if you even call it a metal record, Anima or Inema, depending on how you pronounce it. Tool's Inema had come out not long before that, and so it was about as popular as anything could be. If you were a hard rock metal fan and you didn't like guttural screaming, you were listening to Tool's Anima. And so everyone was basically there for that. Now, as they finished, me and my friends, being big fans of electronic music and big fans of industrial music in that era, we were really excited to see Orbital. Now, Orbital had done a whole series of albums that were really good, and Insides and then The Box. And, me and my friends had this very, very rare import I share with every person I possibly can, which is there is a 30-minute long version of the song, The Box. And if you've never heard it before, it is marvelous. And as a kind of use comic book terminology in the world of music, it is the first appearance of Alison Goldfrapp, the first ever recorded piece of material that features Alison Goldfrapp's vocals, and one of the few songs that Orbital ever did that had Alison Goldfrapp on vocals. Orbital were an amazing headliner, but here's the thing. Nobody cared, right? Like, more than 80% of the building emptied out as soon as Tool finished. Everyone just went home, maybe to beat the traffic. Maybe they just didn't know who Orbital was. Lollapalooza bet well that electronic music was becoming king. But in terms of at least Connecticut and its audience, they didn't bet correctly that it was going to be Orbital that would be the biggest draw. Even though Tool was on all of the tour dates and Orbital was only on some as a stated headliner for certain shows because they were getting really popular. It didn't really have the interest. I've always famously loved that there was a particular song in there where they do their version where they have kind of a mashup of Belinda Carlisle's Heaven Has a Place on Earth along with John Bon Jovi's Shot Through the Heart. And it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. I remember all of us sitting there and, sitting after having stood up and screamed and sang for so many hours before that and just kind of zoned out on it. Enjoyed it. It was wonderful. It was incredible. But it was funny to me to think back on that as much of a great gamble as that was, that so many people were just there for Tool. And, once Tool's on, I don't care. We're out of here. Well, all the great things that Tool means about diversity and open-mindedness and going beyond yourself is like, nah. Once the hard rock and banging were gone, everyone was out. But still, honestly, one for the ages, and still kind of what was the beginning of an obsession of festivals experience, to be able to see so many different bands all in one place that were good like that. So that is all for this week's show. I want to thank you all for joining us and joining us every week. As I've said in the last few shows, we're going to be here through the entirety of 2023. We'll be doing this every week, roughly around 5:30, depending on how things are going and prep for the show. And effectively, we will be doing the same format, and there's going to be some interesting and fun stuff coming. I don't want to tease too much. I don't want to say too much, but we're going to be, meshing with a bunch of different things with format and other different kinds of video content. And so basically, we want to thank you for joining us and being a part of this experience. If you haven't already, please subscribe to us on Twitch, follow us and subscribe to us on YouTube. If you see us on all the different social media platforms, YouTube Shorts or Instagram, or, if Facebook video or on Twitter, any of the places that we post this content, thank you for sharing the content. Thank you for reading, or thank you for watching and seeing what we're saying. Please subscribe and follow us for more, as we're going to be doing this each and every week. Thanks again for joining us. So glad to see you well.